Well, good afternoon and welcome to CEDA's live stream, Improving Australia's Digital Competitiveness. I'm Melinda Salento, the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting you for this live stream today. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging in the spirit of reconciliation. Can I also say that as we contemplate the brave new world of digital technologies, that we don't lose sight of our First Nations people here in Australia and the advantages and insights that they can bring in terms of knowledge and culture and the relevance of that to emerging technologies, and also acknowledge the importance of making sure that as we adopt these new technologies, we reflect on the special rights and place of Indigenous Australians. CEDA is pleased to be hosting this live stream today. We are, of course, partners with the IMD in their production of the World Digital Competitiveness Report, which has come out recently and certainly drawn plenty of attention here in Australia. It's an important topic and one that we've got a fantastic panel assembled to discuss today. I'm not going to say too much about it because I want to leave as much time as possible for them and for the Q&A with you. As always, if you can join us through social media as well and get your interesting insights out to a wider audience, we'd really appreciate that. Please tag us at CEDA_news on Twitter, tag me at Melinda Salento, and use the hashtag #OzDigital. Of course, we also like to involve you in our conversation, which you can do with the Pigeonhole app, which you can enter through the live stream browser that you've got, or enter ceda.pigeonhole.at in your browser with the password OzDigital. Through Pigeonhole, you can ask questions to our speakers and panelists. You can vote on questions that have been asked by others, and you can also provide us with feedback on today's events. So if you haven't already done so, please jump onto the Pigeonhole app, start firing your questions. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of them. So if you want your question asked, get in early and get some other people in voting behind you. Of course, I would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for today, SAS. Without these sponsors and support of organisations like SAS, we can't deliver these live streams to you. So thank you very much for your support, and you'll be hearing from James from SAS later on as well. As I said, I'm going to jump right into it. So let me start by just introducing our panelists. Each of them is going to speak for 5 minutes. I am going to try to hold them to that, although I suspect that is going to be a challenge. And then I'll be back to moderate the Q&A. We'll have about half an hour for the Q&A and close promptly at 4:30. So to our panelists today, we've got Arturo Bris, who is the director of the IMD World Competitiveness Centre. Kate Pounder, who is the CEO of the newly formed Australian Tech Council, John Whittle, Director of Data 61, and James Malizis, who is the Customer Advisory Director for SAS ANZ. With that, I'm going to now ask Arturo to make his opening remarks, and then he will hand on to Kate, and I'll be back in about 20 or so minutes. Over to you, Arturo.
Good morning from Switzerland. Melinda, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to CEDA for this opportunity to be with you today and to show the results of our 2021 IMD World Digital Ranking. We are very, very pleased that it's receiving attention in Australia. And of course, we're all willing to contribute to the improvement of the digital competitiveness of the country. For us, digital competitiveness refers to the ability of a nation to implement digital transformation at all levels. And at the end of the day, this ability boils down to three main issues, or as we call them, factors. The first factor is the availability of digital talent. That is not only the quality of the education system, but also the ability of the country to attract digital talent from abroad. Second is the quality of the country's digital infrastructure, which also encompasses regulation and availability of capital for digital new ventures. And finally, what we call future readiness, which is the set of attitudes, both by the private and the public sector, both by individuals and corporates, toward digital transformation. I think in these three fronts, it's very important to see how countries have been changing during the pandemic. It is evident to most of us that the path toward digital transformation of countries has accelerated. And unfortunately, our rankings, because there are rankings, do not capture that. But one of my first statements is that naturally, countries are today more digitally competitive than they used to be, at least as a general path. A second trend that we have highlighted this year is that at the same time, the world is becoming more bipolar. Given that digital transformation is going to lead the prosperity improvements for most countries in the coming years, the increases in productivity and competitiveness overall, we have a bipolar world where China and the United States are dominating the digital world, and then there is a rest of countries that are trying to catch up. And that is dangerous because this is going to boost inequalities at all levels. Obviously, technology is going to drive economic inequalities, but also social inequalities. The third trend that we have picked up is that we're in a data economy. And then as a data economy, I think we need to think of data as a third productive resource on top of capital and labor. And creating a data economy requires also regulation and infrastructure. So let me in this context mention Australia. So Australia is, unfortunately, I'm not bringing you good news, but is one of the few countries whose ranking decreases significantly in 2021. It drops to the 20th position, knowing well that Australia remains as one of our most competitive countries overall. This decline of 5 positions in the ranking, I think, is explained by a combination of factors. Remember that I mentioned talent and education, infrastructure, and attitude. And in the three factors, Australia falls. With respect to talent, I think the main reason for the drop is a decline in the attractiveness of the country to foreign talent, lack of international experience of Australian managers, and so on, even though still it is not a very, very worrisome drop. I think all countries suffer the same because there's a scarcity of talent overall. I think competition for digital talent is increasing. My only message here would be that Australia cannot lose this race to attract talent because it has proven itself as a very important attractor in the past years. With respect to technology, we see a very significant decline. First, in terms of the regulatory framework, mostly driven by more strict immigration laws, scientific research legislation, even intellectual property rights. There is a perception among Australian economists, among Australian executives, that this is becoming weaker in the country. Second, a reduction in the availability of capital to fund digital startups. And this is reflected very well in our indicator of funding for technological development, where Australia falls 13th position. And finally, in the technological framework, we also see a deterioration of objective measures of usage of technology, which is really strange because in 2020, as you can imagine, and in 2021, the use of technology has increased overall. However, for example, we see that the number of mobile broadband subscribers in Australia drops in 2021, which is very different to what happens in other countries. So I have spoken about talent, about technology. The last aspect that I want to highlight when it comes to the competitiveness of Australia is the future readiness or attitude. And here again, we see that business agility in particular suffers in 2021. For us, the speed of transformation for companies is paramount. And this explains why countries like Denmark or Singapore or Switzerland top the rankings. In business agility, Australian companies still rank pretty low. And I remember in my last trip to Australia, I mentioned exactly the same aspect. In terms of business agility, our survey shows that Australian companies rank 56 out of 64 countries, being this one of the weakest indicators of the country overall. And this, at the end of the day, explains why digital attitudes overall have been also in a decline. Finally, and by the way, when we talk about individual attitudes, they have also weakened, because in our survey, individuals show that attitudes towards globalization are now more negative than they used to be 2 years ago. So I think overall, the good news is that there is room for improvement, but in a context in which the world is becoming more competitive, in the sense that countries are competing more for technologies, I think Australia cannot miss that boat and lose that race. So I just pass the mic and the floor to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you for the segue, Arturo, and for the thoughtful discussion of where we stand in relation to the rest of the world. I'm going to give you a slightly different take today. So I want to look at a different story. I actually think that digital competitiveness has incredibly increased in Australia over the last few years in particular. And I'm going to talk you through why that is. And I'm also going to explain in the activity and the outcomes that I think really matter to digital competitive, why the story looks a bit different to the data Arturo has given us. I'm then going to tell you, though, why I agree that there is a big opportunity in digital for Australia, and that I think there is more that we could be doing to seize on that. And I'm finally going to end by telling you what I think the 3 key steps are that will achieve those outcomes. So firstly, why do I believe momentum is increasing when Arturo's data tells us that we're falling behind? Well, the first reason is we've been measuring the contribution of the tech sector in Australia, which is the direct companies in the sector like software companies, it's online commerce across retail and wholesale trade. And it's also the level of digital activity in all those industries outside the direct sector, so mining, banking, etc. And when we sum up that activity, it's worth $167 billion to the Australian economy, or 8.5% of GDP. What that means in real terms is that the value of tech sector in our economy is now equivalent to the 3rd biggest industry, only just behind banking and behind mining. And that sector has actually risen very rapidly in terms of its share of activity, such that it would have been 9th in 2016 and it's 3rd today. So that's one reason why I'm not sure, at least in absolute terms, that Australia is declining. It's also a big employer. So it's 860,000 Australians are employed in tech occupations today. A software engineer is now a more common job than a plumber, than a hairdresser, than a high school teacher, or even a solicitor. When we look at tech jobs in the economy, we also see that they are growing rapidly. And again, this is a global phenomenon, and I'm talking in absolute terms, but absolutely we have seen 66% growth in jobs in the tech sector since 2005. That compares to 35% on average in the economy. Last year, we created 65,000 tech jobs in Australia. So that made it second only behind retail as a source of new jobs creation in our economy. And again, you know, if economy was falling into decline and falling behind, I just don't believe you would be seeing that level of activity. On another measure, so one of the measures that has tended to bedevil Australia historically when it comes to digital competitiveness has been our ability to create new companies. And a part of that was because we hadn't historically had as strong or large a VC system as other countries. But we've made some really important changes, particularly in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, to our tax incentives and VC funding arrangements. And that has driven a huge uplift in the amount of VC funding that is now available in Australia, such that from 2016 to today, we've seen a 145% increase. And all the everything I'm hearing from my VC members is that COVID has further accelerated that. Now, I'm not saying that Australia is at the level, obviously, of the big markets, but what's happened as a consequence of that extra capital coming in is that Australia's tech sector has boomed. So this is showing you how many new tech sector companies Australia's been creating each decade that have ended up with valuations of $100 million or more. And what you can see is we've created about 100 companies in the last couple of decades, 67 of them, or 2/3, the company was only founded from 2010 onwards. So there's a rapid rate of acceleration. And you can see that's actually following in some ways that rush of additional VC capital that's now finding its way into Australian firms. I think it's also because we've moved to software as a service, becoming one of the predominant areas of growth in the tech sector, and fintech, which are both areas that Australia's turned out to be very, very good at globally. Consequently, we're now turning out some incredibly globally competitive countries. So Atlassian, $100 billion valuation, if it was listed on the ASX, would be the 4th biggest company in Australia. Canva just did a big raise about a week and a half ago, now valued at $55 billion. Equally, if listed, would be the 9th biggest company in Australia. Afterpay is listed at 15th biggest company in the country, just did a $39 billion acquisition from Square. That is the biggest ever corporate acquisition in Australia's history. Then we have companies like Wisetech, about the 21st biggest company, is pioneering the use of supply chain software right around the globe. Not to mention very young companies like Airwallex and GoOne. Airwallex has invented basically a global bank account to let businesses trade. GoOne is, they call it the Spotify for corporate education. So this is 5 of those 100, but GoOne is now already a $1 billion company. Airwallex is a $5 billion company. So there is actually a huge rate of growth of very valuable globally companies that Australia is producing. And that rate is accelerating, which is also why I don't think necessarily our competitiveness is declining relative to where we were, because those companies are attracting global investors. I mean, a company like Canva as well, to put this in context, is now the biggest privately held software company in the world. And that, came out of Australia. It's also the biggest, by the way, privately held company led by a female CEO. Tesla, the biggest company in the world, chaired by a female CEO, and that chair is Robin Denholm, who's also an Australian based here in Sydney. So our leaders in this sector are having impact on the world stage. And what we think that means is that tech industries are really starting to transform the composition of our economy. So the value of that tech activity is already bigger than manufacturing. It's on track to be bigger than primary industries by 2030. That's a pretty fundamental change in who we are as a nation. But I agree we could be doing better, and I agree we should be aiming higher, and I agree that no one else in the world is sitting on their hands right now. So one area where we can do better is that our direct tech sector is still relatively smaller in our economy versus a lot of other countries. So it's only 3.8% of GDP, whereas even in Canada it's 6.8%, the UK, 8%, US 10%. So therefore, we've set 3 goals. We've said we think that we should be aiming to employ 1 million Australians in tech-related jobs by 2025, that we should grow the value of tech sector activity in our economy to $250 billion by 2030, and we should make Australia a great place to start and grow companies. That would basically make us look like Canada. I realise that's one of the least inspiring statements someone's given, but I think it's actually a realistic one, and one that we can achieve, and that would deliver real jobs and value in our economy. I won't go into detail, but we've actually released a roadmap yesterday showing where we think those jobs come from. And critically, it's the startups and scaling Australian business is important, but where we're lowest in our economy relative to some other places in the rest of the world is having large companies. So large Australian companies that scale, like a Canva or Atlassian, and attracting multinationals to invest in Australia and make us a regional hub. We are also, and this is where I agree with Arturo, we tend to be a bit lower in the way that businesses outside the tech sector are adopting tech. So we think there's also some real gains to be had there. Very briefly, the 3 things that we think will make a difference to the way we perform in the next sort of 5 years or so. So the first one is getting more capital into the market. And there's been this historic focus in Australia on R&D and venture capital. They remain important. There's a bit more we can do, but we think we actually lag more in foreign direct investment and business investment in tech. And so for this next sort of 5 years, we should be focusing predominantly on how we lift those areas, because that's where more of the jobs and growth will come. We think the biggest challenge for the industry is to get workers to fill the jobs that we're creating. We think this is the single biggest risk to whether we actually achieve these goals. Historically, transitions into the sector mid-career have been the main way we've attracted workers. We think that's going to have to almost double in size over the next 4 to 5 years, which will require a massive reskilling effort to get 60,000 additional Australians into jobs. We also think that attracting graduates from training and skill migration will continue to be really important inputs, but we're reaching the point where we're kind of at capacity for the number of people we can start to take from those. So we have to rethink reskilling as well. We finally think there's an opportunity to be a digital economy leader. When we've looked at the rest of the world, we see that the kinds of companies who are probably performing best in Arturo's index are people who've actively chosen to regulate in a way that will allow the enablement of new products and services, but safely and responsibly. We find they get an economic bump when they do it. We think if Australia was able to move from rating somewhere between a laggard and a medium performer, which is where we come now, to a leader, we would actually turbocharge growth, and that would let us hit our targets earlier. So I partly agree, Arturo, with your diagnosis versus a country, but I also think there's some really good news stories in there and a lot of good momentum to build upon. But I'm going to hand to John now.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I'm probably going to continue along those lines a little bit. I do think that when these various global innovation rankings come out, there is a tendency within Australia to look at our results and be quite pessimistic about that. So whether those rankings are coming out from the IMD or the OECD or the WIPO or countless others, we somehow end up in a predictable dialogue. And that is that Australia is lagging behind, and then this kind of sense of national angst sets in amongst all of us. And I think we could easily spend this hour doing that, but it's probably more interesting and more constructive to go in a slightly different direction, because I actually think that we've got a lot that we can be positive about. And in particular, I'll focus on the emerging digital technologies, things like artificial intelligence, blockchain, cybersecurity, robotics, quantum technologies. And if you look at those, there's a case to be made that Australia is actually performing rather well. If we take artificial intelligence or AI as an example, to give you some different rankings, there's Stanford's Global AI Vibrancy Index that actually ranks Australia 8th in the world. There's another index, which is a composite index based on AI readiness from Oxford Insights, and that ranks us 11th in the world. And then there's a Nature Index, which looks at the universities in AI and actually ranks 4 of our Australian universities in the top 100 globally for AI. And certainly in some areas of AI, we can legitimately consider ourselves to be not just world leading, but world dominant. If you take the Australian Institute for Machine Learning, for example, based in Adelaide, they claim to rank 2nd in the world for computer vision. And it's not just AI. We're seeing similar successes in other emerging technologies as well. Australia's got a world-class quantum technology capability. Our citations there are 60% above the global average, and we've got an emerging and maturing quantum industry right here at home. And then let's look at robotics. So in fact, just over a week ago, an Australian team competed globally at the DARPA Subterranean Robotics Challenge in Kentucky in the US. And the challenge was to develop teams of fully autonomous robots to explore underground environments. And guess what? Australia claimed a silver medal. In fact, we tied for equal points with the winner, and it was really a photo finish for second. So I'd argue that we actually came equal first in that challenge. So I think there's actually many reasons why we can be optimistic. But yes, of course, there are areas for improvement. We can't deny that. And to overcome some of the limitations outlined in Arturo's report, I would argue that we need to focus on 4 key things. So the first of those is that I think we need to get away from our natural tendency towards fragmentation in the digital ecosystem. Now, we see this in AI, cybersecurity, robotics. We see that we've got pockets of excellence, but we've got this natural inclination to divide and conquer ourselves, which for a country of just 25 million is never a good thing. And in fact, the need to avoid this fragmentations was one of the driving motivations behind the creation of Australia's new National AI Centre, which will launch later this year. With such strength in AI, I really feel like we've got the potential to be on the world stage, but that we need to collaborate as an entire ecosystem to do that. And this new National AI Centre will see $53 million invested into Australian AI, with a particular focus on how we can translate AI innovation into practice and support Australian business to adopt AI. Secondly, we need to do more on nurturing digital talent. Yes, as Kate has pointed out, but I would argue that we actually need to think a little bit differently in terms of how we do this. So our universities, and I used to be a dean at a university, so I know, we train thousands of IT and computer science students every year, but I don't think we do anywhere near enough in cross-training those students so that they can develop both a high IQ, but also a high EQ, so that they can develop an entrepreneurial mindset from day one of their studies, and so they can get interdisciplinary training and learn how to apply their digital skills in sectors like manufacturing, health, and resources that are critical to the Australian economy. And again, we're seeing some positive developments in this direction. So the Australian government earlier this year announced in the budget that it was going to invest $50 million into 2 next generation scholarship programs, which will be led by CSIRO's Data 61, which will aim to partially address these gaps. So in those programs, we'll have teams of students working together in cohorts embedded with a key industry partner to learn interdisciplinary aspects of emerging technologies and learn how to apply them in domains critical for economic development. And crucially, the intention is that these students will be taught from day one what it means to be an entrepreneur, so that instead of commercialization being an afterthought at the end of their studies, these next generation students will have an eye on commercialization from the start. My third point is that I think we need to take our seat at the table internationally and partner with the best that the world has to offer. We won't ever be able to lead at everything, but I think, as I've shown, we've got genuine world-leading capability, but to really leverage that and get the visibility for that it deserves, we need to partner with the best internationally, because those kinds of collaborations that follow will lift us. And fourth, and finally, which I think relates to Arturo's business agility point, I think for Australia to really succeed on the world stage when it comes to digital competitiveness, we frankly need an attitude adjustment. I think we need quite a big cultural change. We need to think much bigger and more ambitiously. And in fact, as Jeremy Howard, who is a successful returning Australian entrepreneur, recently put it, if you do a pitch in Silicon Valley, it's often greeted with the response of, well, can't you do something bigger? Whereas in Australia, the response you get is, could it be a little bit smaller? So one solution to this is to pursue more mission-driven research and development, and we're certainly doing this at CSIRO. So by setting grand challenges with clear innovation and economic outcomes, we can bring ecosystems together and we can avoid that kind of fragmentation. And just to come back to the robotics example, I think there's no better example of that than our Australian silver medal winning robotics team. And if you look at that, what happened there, it was over a period of 3 years, hundreds of researchers and engineers came together, focused around one very specific and one very clear goal, which was how can you get teams of robots autonomously navigating and exploring underground environments like caves and tunnels. But the point is that this wasn't just a game. Much like previous DARPA Challenge events, this latest subterranean challenge has already produced commercial outcomes, including spin-out companies. And I expect we will see many more of those kinds of spin-outs in the years to come. So I think this is an example of Australian digital innovation at its finest. And I argue that this kind of mission-driven R&D is a model for the rest of us to follow. And with that, I'll thank you for listening, and I will pass you over to James.
Thank you, John. I'm delighted to join this panel, and especially a thank you to our panel speakers for those valuable insights into Australia's digital competitiveness. At SAS, we've been using analytics to solve the toughest problems facing businesses and society in Australia and globally for decades, whether that's helping organisations analyse their customer interactions to strive for continual improvement, identifying ways that analytics can build and entrench customer loyalty, optimise operations and streamline maintenance, all the way through to how analytics can and has played a role in how organisations and governments in Australia are responding to the pandemic. In essence, what we do is work with organisations looking for immediate value from their data, to discover insights from their data and make sense of it all, to identifying what's working and fix what isn't, to make more intelligent decisions, drive relevant changes. Therefore, at our core, we are an organisation of problem solvers, using analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning to combine our curiosity with powerful technology. In that light, I was very curious and at first somewhat surprised by some of the findings behind Australia's slide in the IMD World Digital Competitiveness Rankings. The report does highlight Australia's declining performance in terms of future readiness, and in particular, I want to comment on the knowledge transfer aspect between the business sector and universities, as well as the importance of business agility to respond to opportunities and threats. I think, no doubt, it's critical that we continue to support and invest in education initiatives that promote learning for all by focusing on closing the analytic skill gap, encouraging interest in STEM, STEM being science, technology, engineering and mathematics topics, and enabling data literacy. Supporting universities across Australia, the goal is to enable Australia's future workforce. Specifically, we drive initiatives such as the Academic Outreach Program, which exists fundamentally to support and promote the learning of AI, machine learning, and analytical concepts, and to support universities develop programs designed with data analytics jobs in mind. To achieve this, we have invested in new partnerships, for example, collaborating with Macquarie University and Coursera. We've integrated industry digital certification paths into the university's fully online global MBA program. So that's an example of a very focused and specific linkage between the business sector and academia. Australia's ranking with respect to business agility was also highlighted in the IMD report. Now, business agility is all about enabling businesses to be more adaptive, creative, and resilient, dealing with complexity, uncertainty, and change. And we have certainly had a lot of that, leading to better outcomes, greater value for customers. Now, as a case in point, Virgin Australia, you may remember they managed to exit voluntary administration at the end of last year. Well, they used COVID and the lack of flights. They swiftly went on the front foot into planning mode to drive the business once we started flying again. For Virgin, that included building profitability models and activity-based costing down through the customer level, something that they've never done before. So they know who their valued customers are, what demand looks like, and what routes to open up to maximise profitability in the future, all within a matter of months. Of course, however, when it comes to business agility, most organisations don't have the luxury, if I can call it that, of a slowdown to pause and plan for better times. Agility drives sustainable outcomes, and often the need to adapt comes at the most pressing of times. So a case in point, the daily pressure of working on the front line of the pandemic has put a strain on many healthcare workers, their mental well-being. I'm sure most of you have heard of the Black Dog Institute, a medical research organisation that seeks to find better ways to prevent and treat mental illness. So they drew on research showing that more than 50% of healthcare professionals are worried about contracting COVID, and 80% are concerned for their loved ones. So the Black Dog Institute responded by developing the Essential Network, or 10, for health professionals. As part of the Australian government's package to support mental health, I believe back in May last year, and to support the mental health and the well-being of Australians, 10, the Essential Network, has been designed by health professionals for health professionals. It's a digital platform that links health professionals to a free, confidential ecosystem of individualised mental health support. The service puts the healthcare worker at the centre of a range of care options, empowering them to choose combinations of care that match their needs. Through the essential network, health professionals can tailor their care according to their individual needs. So whilst we are questioning business agility, whilst we are questioning the knowledge transfer from business to universities, there are many, many examples of where we're doing well, we're doing the right things, and very innovative thinking and execution in the Australian economy. With that, Melinda, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, James. So I've been keeping tabs of the questions coming in, plus I've not surprisingly got a few of my own. Just for the benefit of the panelists, I think what I'm going to do is try to direct a question to each panelist, to one panelist, and we'll get a perspective on that and move on so that we can get to as many questions as possible rather than having an all-in conversation about one particular question, if that's all right. I'm going to start with a question on skills. In the IMD survey, actually, one of the things that we noticed when we were looking at it is that we still actually do pretty well in the ratings in terms of international students coming in. We fall down on skills, but there's maybe a little bit more to come in terms of pain in our rankings as a result of closed borders. And Kate, I know you and I talked about this before the live stream started. The question that's been asked is really, how do we strike the right balance in terms of growing our own skills, which is going to take time, versus bringing skills in and our reliance on skilled migration, and the balance between the immediacy of need for experience and skills versus organically growing. What are your thoughts on that?
Great question. Firstly, as my thoughts, I think that when you're talking about the volume of jobs we're creating, no one measure is going to solve the question. So it's a matter of doing all of the above. I think that just because of the numbers of people that come in via skilled migration, it's always going to be a supplement to our domestic labour market because so many more people are already in the workforce or coming through the training system. So that's why we're saying about 140,000 Australians will need to come in mid-career to the tech sector, and why that's the most probable way that we can really generate extra workers. We also think reskilling is a really smart response because it allows for a faster training course, because often you're topping up skills, and that goes, I think, to John's point as well, that it's not like someone is starting at zero. They may have some good skills in place and you're topping them up and you're training them, and then they can continue that training and work. So that's why we think reskilling is really going to become a big part of the solution. But absolutely, international students, absolutely skilled migration remain important. There's good evidence that shows, for example, skilled migration, if we can bring in a very experienced, say, product manager, someone who's been working in Silicon Valley or India or the UK has managed big teams, if we can bring them in to Australia, they share a lot of knowledge. They let us hire big Australian teams underneath them, and that often keeps critical product development and R&D activity in Australia rather than seeing it migrate overseas to sort of follow that talent. So it's very important, and it's a multiplier of local jobs to have it. So we support, as I said, all of the above, because we need to get 1 million people in those jobs by 2025.
Thanks, Kate. And I'm sure anyone who's interested should jump on your website and have a look at the work that you've done there. I'm going to sort of add one of my questions onto one of the questions that's here in the Pigeonhole poll. John, you talked a lot about the AI capabilities that we've got here in Australia, and you've argued that it's a strength. But I think one of the areas perhaps where we're sort of falling down is the translation of AI expertise that's sitting amongst researchers and universities and the take-up of that by business. I'd be interested in your views about what more can be done there. But the question I want to hook it to is the one that relates to concerns about privacy and data. And of course, that leads to the issue of ethical AI and you know, how you translate the technological capabilities as well as the ethical capabilities. And I think you also spoke about multidisciplinary sort of knowledge, which I think sits in there, the answer to that as well. So a big question, yep. I know, but maybe you might like to give us some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. And the premise of the first part of the question is absolutely right. So we do tend to do better in the kind of research part. as opposed to the translation, or put it another way, we're really good on the R in the R&D, but maybe not so good on the D. And in fact, if you look at that AI index from Stanford that I pointed out, where I said we come 8th in the world, you can actually break that down. And on the R part, we actually come 5th in the world. And on the innovation, or the D part, we actually come 11th in the world. So there is definitely an issue to address there. I think some of those measures in the government budget, the federal budget that we saw earlier this year, are aiming to address those. So the National AI Center is very firmly focused on business adoption of AI. So how can we do the translation? And in particular, it's got a big focus on supporting SMEs. And the Next Generation Scholarship Program that I talked about is deliberately designed to be different. It's not supporting research students in the traditional way, where you would just give them a scholarship and let them do research and a PhD for 3 years. And then maybe at the end of that, there's something that's potentially commercializable, but it's too late to start thinking about it. We want to upfront that commercial thinking. On the second part of the question, which relates to privacy or more broadly ethics, that's actually an area where I think Australia could really be leading. And in fact, if you go back a couple of years, we were leading in that area. Back in 2019, Data 61 led to the Australian government initiative to develop the Australian AI ethics framework, which is now in place. And at that time, it was one of the first in the world to develop such an AI ethics framework. Now, since then, just about every country you can think of has got an AI ethics framework. And so we've perhaps fallen a little bit behind again. But where we can leapfrog is that the challenge now is to take those high-level principles, such as privacy, and actually translate them into something concrete, to operationalize them so that developers can actually do something with them. And I think if we focus our efforts on that in Australia, then we can actually see ourselves take the lead once again.
Oh, John, I've got to tell the audience that I promise I didn't, that wasn't as much of a leading question as I expected, because actually the operationalising AI ethics is an area of work that we're tackling through our own public interest technology agenda. So hopefully we might work together on that, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road.
Absolutely. We're working on that actively too, so we should get together.
we should. The good governance of tech and AI. Now, I'm not going to answer a question here, but I am going to do Chris Sampson a favour. Chris, you've got a question here which I really think is almost like a comment. Chris is sort of saying he'd like to understand more about the IMD's work. Arturo, I'm going to do you a favour too, because Chris, what you might want to do is pick up Arturo's latest book, On the Right Place, how national competitiveness makes or breaks companies. And that book, in part of that book, one of the things that Arturo does is explain the links between the competitiveness work that the IMD does and digital competitiveness and all the rest of that. So if you want a more of a deep dive, you can have a look there. I haven't just raised that without wanting to create a segue for you, Arturo. The issue of collaboration came up in our comments. And also a mission-led approach. And I know from your book that you are a fan of Mariana Mazzucato's approach here, and she, of course, is a big supporter of the sort of public-private sort of partnership approach and collaboration. Just wondering if you might like to say a little bit more about that, and also to what extent the rankings actually reflect on Australia's abilities in terms of collaboration and partnership and knowledge transfer.
Yeah, and this is fundamental. I think that, if you look at the success cases of digital transformation, Singapore, but probably more closely to Australia, Denmark, they all show that success in digital competitiveness comes from I will call it communion between the public and the private sector. I think this communion goes in both directions, as you mentioned. One is by the government providing funding, is the entrepreneurial state, like the importance of government funding and support for digital initiatives, but also is how the private sector can support the public sector in its journey through transformation. And that's why Denmark, for example, is a good case study, because Denmark succeeded at implementing digital ID and a mandatory, for example, digital post, not only by imposing it by law, but also by facilitating the creation of Danish companies based on those technological advances. Okay, and I think that partnership is going to be key in the future. I'm in Switzerland. A few months ago, we had a referendum here to vote about digital ID, and it was rejected by more than 64% of the population. And the reason is that it was imposed from the top. I think that individuals here realized that the government cannot just impose digital ID without the private sector seeing the benefits. And I think it's when this relationship, I think, is going to flourish in many countries. When you see combined effort by both the public and the private sector.
Thanks, Arturo. James, I am going to bring you into this conversation as well. We've got a question that basically asks whether the tech sector is failing to work with the non-tech sector. So the comment is that I'm hearing that the tech sector is ready to fly, but Australia is not. So perhaps from your perspective, you might like to just give us some thoughts about, how well the tech sector is really working across the broader economy, and are there any barriers to doing more?
Well, I guess the simple part of that, the answer here is that the tech sector is driven by their customers. So in whatever sector those customers are part of. So, at SAS and all, I'm sure all applies to all technology vendors and software organizations, you are driven by the customers, and our customers have a thirst for innovation. We live in very much a subscription world, and a lot of our solutions are as a service with an annual fees, etc. And it's no longer the case where we can expect customers to simply sign off on their renewal fee and continue on with the additional elements of the solution. They're, as I said, they've got a real hunger for innovation, and what this means is they're demanding it, and they're asking. Our key customers are constantly asking us, what else can we do? How else can we move the needle? And so the main avenue, I think without a doubt, that the tech sector is working with the non-tech sector is through the customers. Of course, I went through the academia, the university piece, and again working with the universities is a big component as well, and that relationship starts from the very beginning, where we need to start designing curriculums and programs with the sole intention of turning out students who are proficient in the tech area, and in our case, obviously, it's analytics and AI. So those two things combined. So I would say is tech working with non-tech. Well, that's forced upon us. Absolutely.
Thanks, James. Now, I know everyone who's been in Pigeonhole has been wondering when I am going to ask the number one question, and I wanted to make sure that we sort of got to some of the other things, because this is the bigger one, I think, that we can all talk about at length, perhaps. It is about this issue around negative attitude and whether we're sort of talking ourselves down. How do we think about that differently? And I guess the broader question from that then is, how do we change that narrative? And so I'm going to break this down into two parts. And firstly, Arturo, just from a survey perspective or rankings perspective, I want to ask you about, is there a sense that maybe Australia and Australian executives are just a little bit glass half full here, or half empty, I should say, that we're just down on ourselves and that we just consistently rate ourselves on more negatively than others? And then I'm going to go to John and Kate and ask them about how is it that we change this narrative, which I think is a subtext of your comments, or not even a subtext, was a direct challenge in your comments. So Arturo, first to the survey, and then to Kate, and then John.
Yes, and I remember, Melinda, that you have spoken about this in the past. When it comes to our executive survey, Australian executives tend to be very pessimistic. It is true that there are some objective indicators in the data that show a weakening, but by and large, the fall in the rankings this year is driven primarily by executive perceptions. And in that sense, I agree with Kate, John, and James earlier in that the things are not as bad as the survey seems to reflect, but it is also true that consistently consistently. In our annual surveys, Australian executives, they rank the country worse than the objective data seems to say. That's not unique. There are many countries, including my own, Spain, many European countries and Latin American countries, where there is a very negative perception, not only about the government, but also about the country overall. And I think the event today may contribute to that, because I think my colleagues here in the panel are showing that things are not as bad as the survey seems to suggest.
Thanks, Arturo. Kate, thoughts on how we might change that narrative?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. So as I said, I think that this narrative might have been true a decade ago, but it's more that the facts have changed and we haven't updated the story that goes with it. So I think we have a job as an industry actually in better explaining what we're doing in Australia, the impact we're having, the opportunity it creates, as well as people like John at Data 6 to 1. You know, that's a great success story. I think that was founded in 2000. It's gone on to be this incredible national ICT institute, now part of CSIRO. So there's a lot of good stories to tell. So I think we have to do that. But secondly, I think, you know, the difference between the story and a plan is one is a fantasy. So that's why when we came out at launch, we wanted to set some concrete goals. We wanted to put some concrete ideas behind them and give people a plan that they can react to. I can certainly say since we launched on August 11th, we've had an incredible reception. We had over 300 requests for information, requests for meeting within 2 weeks of launching. We launched a roadmap yesterday, front page of the newspaper. I'm, you know, sitting here hearing my LinkedIn going crazy because I can already hear people pinging me, you know, asking to get involved. So I actually think there's a lot of excitement in the community. I just think we have to give people a clear explanation of the impact, the benefits, you know, to push people about where we can improve further, and then have a concrete plan that we all get behind to deliver it.
Thanks. And John, just to perhaps lead you a little bit, I think, you know, one of the other issues that I think sits at the heart of this is how we can deal with this issue of fragmentation as well. So perhaps you might like to reflect on both the kind of the narrative and the sort of how we talk about ourselves, but also some of the practicalities of bringing some of that together a little bit better.
Sure. Look, for me, it all comes down to having inspirational examples. And I think we don't do enough in the world to tell the rest of the world about the great inspirational examples that are going on. And I only moved here from the UK about 4 years ago, and even in that relatively short period of time, I've seen a lot more inspirational examples. You know, you look at a lot of the companies that Kate was talking about, the Canvas and the Afterpay. I mean, these incredibly inspirational examples, and we need more like that. But I think we've got a kind of general, modesty as a country that we don't kind of blow our own trumpet. I mean, when I was at Monash University as the dean there prior to my current role, I recruited about 100 computer science academics from all over the world. And the experience of recruiting them was always the same. You call them up randomly, they're in some other part of the world, and you tell them what a great place Australia is, and they're like, yeah, whatever. And then you keep talking to them, and eventually you convince them to get on a plane, and they come to one of our great Australian universities, and they start walking around the campus, and they're just like aghast, and they're like, wow, this is an amazing place. Why didn't you tell me? And I was like, well, that's what I've been trying to do. We've got amazing universities, we've got amazing companies, we've got, amazing things happening here. But we tend to take a very national lens on everything, even in the conversations related to digital competitiveness and innovation. We're often thinking at it at a national level. I would argue that we need to be getting out there in the rest of the world, and I think that then comes back to the fragmentation argument, because to do that as a small country, we need to come together and all be singing from the same hymn sheet so that we can get the attention that we deserve elsewhere.
You've given me the perfect segue, John, into one of the other questions that's been sitting at the top of the list here, which is around, I'll use Dylan's language exactly so I don't do it an injustice, which is, how concerned are you about the, in inverted commas, balkanisation of the Australian internet from global norms through domestic regulation and perhaps a national focus, if you like, and how does that affect our digital competitiveness? Is that an issue from your perspective?
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
Oh, sort of taking a different approach to the rest of the world in terms of how we regulate the internet, and that's the question from Dylan in terms of the balkanisation.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a concern. I don't know. Maybe Kate's got a better take on that one.
I sort of looked it up myself, I have to say, while I was secretly here. The splinter net or the balkanisation. Obviously not a concern for you. Something on your radar, Kate, or not?
I have to ask you to repeat the question. Sorry, I was getting texted by people at the same time. Sorry.
Well, Dylan's sort of suggesting that that we've got a problem here with the so-called balkanisation or the splintering of the internet here in terms of different domestic regulations applying to it. I have to say it's not something that's been high on my list of issues that people have spoken to me about. Is it something that's on your radar, or if not, I think we've answered it.
It is on my radar, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that increasingly we're starting to conflate. We're talking about critical technologies and strategic technologies and saying we have economic and security goals for both of them without sometimes thinking about how the security goals are, how the administration of them is impacting the economic achievements. So I think that we're not a leader in regulation. You know, that came clearly out when we looked at our research. We're probably more of a laggard, a medium there. And that's not to say we couldn't be. I actually think there's a lot of people in government in Australia that understand the importance of the digital economy and would like us to do better. You know, great people like Jane Hume, she's doing really good work, you know, Ed Husick on the ALP side. But I don't think that's yet translating into an approach to regulation that puts as much weight on opportunity as it does risk. And I think at times, if we really want to generate strategic industries, they're going to have to be global ones, like John says, which means their finance will have to come globally. We'll be drawing on, you know, talent and customers from around the world. And we need to think about the design of our security measures so that they preserve our security objectives, but without, you know, fundamentally cutting off access to financing or to some of those other global flows. That I think is, and I think that's actually quite possible. You can look at how some other countries are approaching these measures, and you can definitely balance both. It's not an either or, but I do think that's something we need to think about in the next 12 months.
And maybe just quickly, because I do have a thought on it now, because I just looked up the term. Look, I think it comes down to values and, you know, what we value as a nation. And I think, again, that's where we can be a leading light, you know, because with the values that we have, you know, we can show how you can harness these emerging technologies for good and not lead to these negative effects such as this kind of balkanization that Dylan is talking about.
Yeah, thanks, John. And as I fully expected, we have run out of time. I knew we were going to race through this hour. Can I just follow up, perhaps make a point following on from those comments around some of the work that CEDA is doing? Because, again, I think we're very much on the same page, and our public interest technology agenda is really focused on bringing the wider community into this conversation around emerging tech and the benefits that can be provided both to the economy and society and in the public interest. But also just calling out where the risks are and how we can deal with those risks and mitigate them so that you don't get this strong focus on risk without also looking at opportunity, and that we have a really constructive conversation around what the right regulation is, and how we make sure we bring all stakeholders into that from the perspective of being more enabling, rather than ending up at a place where you might get, a regulatory kind of backlash, if you like. So I think a lot of complementarity there. We've got more questions that have come in, and I think we're going to have to think about additional forums on the issue of collaboration. A lot of interest in this issue around fragmentation, and I would really love to pursue the topic of how we scale up so much of what we see in sort of early stages here and make it really create the benefits here in Australia that I think would help us change the narrative pretty quickly, as some of Kate's examples have already started to do. So let me thank our sponsors, SAS. It's great to have you involved in this conversation, but also each of the panelists. You've all brought really interesting insights, and I think we could have gone on for some time yet. Thank you to the audience for being involved. Please make sure you drop your feedback into the Pigeonhole app. We'll see what we can do to bring more of these really stimulating conversations on this really important topic in the coming months and years ahead. If you've got interest in our other work and the other events coming up, which of course traverse a wide range of issues, including next cab off the rank on the important role of childcare, jump onto the website CEDA.com.au and you'll find all of the information there. That's it from me and the panel. Thank you again for being a part, and thanks again to our sponsors, SAS. See you next time.